Hi Cindy, what do we think about the Booker Prize? Yeah? No? Are you hiding? I can't quite tell.
Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the Booker Prize. Quelle surprise. We're about to enter Booker season, and so I'm slowly going back to some of the shortlists. Basically, there's a brief window of time each year, it seems, where I'm actually doing a bit more reading for myself. I'm not, well, I say for myself, this is still prize reading, but where I kind of can add other things to the list and sort of play around a bit more. And this is one of those times, and this is therefore when I've decided to go back and look a little bit at one of the shortlists. And 1971 is the one we're looking at now, which feels like a very long time ago, but I'm slowly gearing up to 1972, because that's then going to be 50 years ago. You can do maths, you know what I mean. Anyway, 1971, and so this was only the third year of the prize. There was another one added in between, the sort of lost Booker Prize, but this is the first one after they changed the rules. So the rules we currently have now are roughly now from this time, and essentially we have this prize where we have 6 books, many of which I did not get on with. So this is, but an interesting one nonetheless. And also, just a side point, Saul Bellow, the American author, was one of the judges this year. And apparently there's sort of these sort of tales of a few of the judges sort of talking, and that Saul Bellow was just this incredibly bizarre figure to be judging a prize with, because he sort of was just there and not particularly excited about a fair few things, just kind of there. Anyway, I'm going to go through the shortlist now, but let's start off with the winner, V.S. Naipaul with In a Free State. And this originally as well, I should say, was a longer book. Now whether it would actually count for the prize is a different matter, but essentially there's one big sort of novella or novel really at the heart of this, and then there are a couple of other sort of short stories attached to it, and so it kind of feels like this thing. But I realized when I read it, I think I read it with some of the short stories in. So it's set in this fictionalized state. It's sort of put quite vaguely as sort of just being within Africa. It's sort of left purposely vague to kind of tease out actually a little bit of a discussion around colonialism. But at the heart of it, we basically have this sort of community that have become increasingly frustrated with this never-ending stream of white Europeans coming in and sort of just throwing money at the problem or acting superior or various other things. And we have this sort of almost bottlenecked area, because it's a hotel or kind of quarters or whatever that is sort of used by these white European settlers. And so the only real time that people come into contact with each other is either people from this colonial state being servers in this sort of hotel or place, or kind of out on the street in sort of other forms. And so there's this very weird distance sort of created between characters, particularly characters from different communities, and we get this sort of strange relationship building within there between a man and a woman who are both in there, one of whom is this official, one of whom is the wife of a sort of a colleague. And there is a strong sense early on that there's something quite bizarre. They're kind of forced together by the fact that they're these sort of only 2 foreigners. It almost reads a bit like a play, actually, this sort of one set play of, you know, characters being sort of trapped together, and they mostly seem to be getting on, but then there's a bit of a sort of difficulty. It's then sort of referred to that Bobby, one of the men, is gay, and that also plays into some of the narrative around this, because we get an idea that he's a sort of he's seen as less than, he's sort of seen as less manly, but also it's another thing that he can be blackmailed with. It's another thing that can be used against him. And so when violence sort of starts to take over, when there seems to be some kind of uprising somewhere in this state that they're living in, it gets quite complicated, because essentially everyone's sort of trying to look out for only themselves, but also there's this strange kind of bonding of like, oh well, you're one of us, we'll look after you. But what does that look like again when one of those characters is gay? And so it's a bit complicated, and it gets, yeah, it ends quite violently at times in a way that I was just like, not sure how comfortable I feel with just sort of like reading the one gay character being sort of constantly belittled as being weak and effeminate and then just like beaten up. Like, not sure how I feel about it. But then in some ways, I guess that's also part of the point of this book, right? That to sort of show the reality of what it might have been like for somebody like Bobby within the sort of frame of this book. But still, yeah, like difficult to read, and yeah, and does some interesting stuff. But that's the book that won, and I can see why. It has sort of more of a global reach, I think, more timely as well, given the time of this prize, sort of 1971. We're talking about lots of countries, former British Empire countries gaining independence, and so actually you see this sort of post-colonial sort of surge in the sort of movement, and actually it feels in some ways right that a book that captures some of that sentiment would win. Even if there are books that might hold up better now, that book might be more timely in some ways, and also just interesting nonetheless. Also, I believe the first sort of non-UK winner of this prize as well, so interesting for that as well. Next up, we have Thomas Kilroy with The Big Chapel, a book that I read fairly recently and didn't really get on with. It's all right. I mean, it's written very well. It's an interesting book. I think I somehow didn't really engage with the characters, and that sort of made me struggle a bit with it. But largely, this book is dealing with a small town and how it navigates sort of history and local society within Ireland, and with all the political difficulties that were going on in Ireland at the time. So there's a lot in this book around this sort of sense of distrust, and this sense of kind of looking a bit over your shoulder and trying to kind of guess what everybody else is doing or thinking. Ultimately didn't fully work for me as a book, but I think it still was interesting nonetheless. It also just sort of seems to go quite a lot through, as the name would suggest, this idea around religion, this sort of chapel being this sort of central idea within a community around religion, but actually the fact that it's left to be kind of go to ruin, or that there's this whole sort of conversation around it, feels particularly fitting. So I did enjoy those parts, and this does read quite quickly, but I think despite it being a sort of tragic comedy kind of book, I think I struggled a little bit with the actual the characterization. So I could get on board with some of the humor, and I'm rubbish at remembering characters anyway, so it's almost definitely a me problem. But towards the end of the book, I was sort of like, I don't know why this moment feels significant for this character, actually, partly, which is me, this is on me, but like, yeah, I found it a bit tricky to really keep focused on that. Nonetheless, Thomas Kilroy, this book has sort of gone on to win other prizes or to be kind of celebrated in other ways. So it's probably a me problem. This is just not particularly my kind of book, but interesting to see something like this on the shortlist anyway, and I'm glad that the shortlist made me read it. Next up, we have Briefing for a Descent into Hell by Doris Lessing. Firstly, a great title. And this book focuses on a man whose sense of reality is rapidly disappearing. And part of that is because he has, it plays around a lot with the idea of what reality is, because he has been on some kind of adventure, at least that he relays. And he is talking about all of these things that are happening in the universe and these things that are coming and what the future is. And so it feels a bit sci-fi when we listen to it from his perspective. But then we get this sort of realism of characters around him who's sort of saying like, yes, that's very nice. Here is your wife. Okay, you don't remember your wife. Okay, I'm playing with this. So it straddles this really interesting line between us as a reader not always knowing, is this character at the heart of it, sort of this Professor Charles Watkins, is he sort of losing track of reality? Is he sort of suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's? Is that why he's forgetting? Or is it, as he says, that he's been on such a big adventure that where time moves differently, and so he's been on these big, huge adventures. He's done so many things over so many years that, of course, he's forgotten his wife, because his wife, in his sort of in his life, he has been away from his wife for many, many years, when actually it's only been maybe a few months of him being in hospital. But then the third kind of factor added onto this is how much of this is also him potentially wanting a break from reality. So it's not maybe just a case of it just being mental ill health, or it just being a sort of a realistic sci-fi thing. How much of it is also that he's potentially trying to make a break from his previous life, where things were going wrong, where he was having a bit of a breakdown? How much of it is him doing that and sort of moving, sort of trying to create a fresh break by sort of pretending he doesn't know his wife, by pretending he doesn't recognize his kids, to move on and do something different. And so it's kind of fascinating, because we get these sort of three things constantly balancing against each other in the book in a way that is very sci-fi and very realistic at the same time. It's sort of archly funny whilst also being incredibly tragic. I found this book really quite intriguing, and I haven't read anything else by Doris Lessing yet. I've been meaning to read The Golden Notebook for like 20 years. I said, not 20 years, I would have been 13, but for a while. And I just think, yeah, it's just such an interesting book that I think about quite a lot after. That's terrible grammar. I have thought about a lot since. But yeah, it's a really interesting one, and just a really fun mix to add to this shortlist. When I get to 1972, I'll be talking about a book by Susan Hill, which does also really similar things in terms of the sort of break with reality. And it's so fascinating, because I think I read both these books quite close to each other. And yeah, so interesting. Unfortunately, we now come to two books that I didn't get on particularly well with. So this 1971 shortlist is basically two books that I really strongly enjoyed, one that I quite enjoyed, and three that I was like, meh. And this one is Mordecai Richler with St. Urbain's Horseman. And this is a funny book, and I kind of want to put that in inverted commas, but also in that way that I think I mentioned when I first reviewed it. I struggle sometimes with funny books, not because of the humour itself, but just because if it's constantly driving towards that, I feel a bit exhausted, and it's sort of, you're constantly being set up for something, and it's quite a lot as a reader. It's almost like having kind of constant action-packed scenes back to back with no sort of soft or downtime. And this is a little bit how I found with this book. There's sort of so many kind of competing voices, and it sort of has this sort of drive of this sort of Jewish family in Canada, and it's interesting for that. I really liked every time we got the little family dynamics and the little references to what it was like to be Jewish, and be in a Jewish neighborhood in the area. I think what I then struggled with was it felt like we had kind of constant jokes that sort of took away from that. And I've read something else by him, Solomon Gursky was here, which I also struggled with. So maybe it's just I have a problem with Mordecai Richler's writing. It's just maybe not for me. But I think, and it's quite a long book, so that was not fun. But this, I think, where it does shine is just sort of in those bits around the family. I think the things I found quite difficult were that the humour as well has not particularly aged well. So so there are some jokes in there, like almost right off the bat, we've got quite a lot of body shaming kind of jokes. We've got a few jokes around sexual assault. And it's all sort of meant to be done in this sort of like legal sort of, there's like a court scene where characters are sort of joking about an incident that's happened, but then you're like, but this is a person who's experienced sexual assault who's on the stand, and you're mocking her, and it's all very weird and uncomfortable. So I struggled with the book on many of those aspects, but otherwise an interesting and good book. I think yeah. I think I could have just done with a really nice family portrait, and would have been done with it there. But anyway, it does sort of play a lot with ideas around identity, around Canada, around sort of a Jewish community, particularly in Quebec. And yeah, so yeah, take from that what you will, but I struggled with it. And the other book that I mentioned that I maybe struggling is a bit harsh for this one, actually. I did enjoy it overall. I think this is Derek Robinson with Goshawk Squadron, or Goshawk, still not entirely sure. And this is a book largely around soldiers fighting in war, and particularly flying planes, hence the sort of squadron part of the title. And actually, yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I was harsh by saying that I sort of struggled with it, because I struggle more generally with war novels, just because I think unless it's a very sort of in-depth focus on someone's character, I can find it quite tricky I don't get excited by big war scenes. I think I just, yeah. So, and luckily this is not too full of war scenes. This does focus on the sort of human aspect a lot more. It's focused a lot more on how these men show up for each other and look after each other in the midst of war, and all the kind of bawdy jokes that go on, all the kind of absolute gallows humor that they need to survive everything that's happening around them. And so it's incredibly dark, and at times little bits of humor creeping in. But it's quite a quick read, so actually I don't know why I'm complaining. But like it goes through, and we learn so much of the story about these men and how they sort of have really struggled with sort of everything going on around them, particularly these very young men fighting in war, and their sort of glory being based on whether they shot down a German today, and actually men just go missing and die on a regular basis. They just disappear. These men who you grew close to, who you've trained with, just suddenly aren't there one day. And so I think the book does do that particularly well. And it's a decent read. I think it's just maybe also one of those things where not a personal taste. I realise it makes it sound like I hate everything based on these. Doesn't like humour, doesn't like war, doesn't like action. Great. But yeah, I think it's an interesting one nonetheless, for sort of looking at sort of the inside voices of war. And last but definitely not least, Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. And I really enjoyed this book. I just thought it was so... I mean, I realised after all of that, I'm just sort of like, no to these other stories. And then here's me being like, here is a very nice story about an old woman and a younger man, and it's just nice, whilst also being quite arch and quite funny and silly. But essentially this book focuses on this idea that there's this older woman, Mrs. Palfrey, she moves into a hotel, the Claremont, hence the title, to sort of see out her last days. And she's surrounded by quite a lot of elderly residents at this hotel. And again, we get that sort of sense of sometimes they'll just disappear because they've died overnight or whatever. But it's sort of this very like, I basically feel like every single person in this I think there was a film of it, but every single person in this film could have basically been played by Judi Dench or like Maggie Smith. Like all of those sort of older characters have that vibe, and it's just really funny to kind of see that, like that kind of archness and that sort of lots of things being said without very much being said. So sort of, something ridiculous happening and someone just going, well, and just moving on, and that being enough to acknowledge that everybody hates this person. So you get this whole kind of cast of characters, and it's interesting because it's sort of framed by this one physical location in this hotel. But essentially, she one day meets this younger man, and this young man, he sort of takes the place of her grandson. She basically has been telling everybody that her grandson's going to come and visit, and he never has, and she feels quite isolated by that. But this man who is an aspiring novelist wants to basically, they sort of strike up a bit of a friendship, but this friendship is sort of transactional in many ways. That I think both of them think at first that there's sort of something to be gained here. So for him, it's that he's a novelist, and he wants to get all these ideas by listening to all these people around him talking and making them into characters. And also you know, Mrs. Palfrey paying for him to have lunch because otherwise he's a struggling, he's a starving artist. And for her, she likes the company, but she also likes the fact that she can tell everybody that her son is here and that her grandson is here. And it obviously leads to this sort of farcical situation towards the end where, you know, Kale Surprise, the grandson's about to show up and she has to sort of navigate this whole thing in this sort of very farcical, silly kind of way. But it's it does sort of become quite beautiful in quite a few ways. There's a real silliness, there's a real Britishness to this book. It's very much full of that absurd British humour, and sort of this upper class sort of ridiculousness. But at the same time, there's something so beautiful about actually firstly seeing an older female character as a central character in a book and the named character on the front of a book, but also just that we get to really see this sort of isolation through her eyes in a really poignant way, but also with silly things thrown in. So I absolutely love this, and I think this would be one of my choices for the win, if not between this and Doris Lessing. And I realise basically of a short list of 6, the 2 women, the ones whose books I'm like, yes, you can win, thank you. But I really enjoyed this book, and I thought it sort of holds up quite well because it's such a period piece in some ways. And I just think it's really interesting. And in the same way, Doris Lessing's book, I think, has so much to say and do and is so daring that I think it really works. Ultimately, yeah, as you might have been able to tell, this is a shortlist where largely, like in many aspects of my life, I've been let down by men. But actually, this is, I think, I get entirely why In a Free State by Naipaul won. It feels like a very good and sort of dynamic book with a lot to say. I just kind of also wish in some ways that Doris Lessing or Elizabeth Taylor had kind of got a little bit of a nod as well. And I guess they did by being shortlisted. But nonetheless, there we go. So that's been me talking about the shortlist. Interested to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these before, and if you've read anything else by these authors. I hope you've enjoyed me mostly rambling about things I don't like. Take care. I've been Bob, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.